This year marks the 35th anniversary of the Falklands War. We are undergraduate history students at the University of Southampton who are completing a project on the Falklands War. We have been investigating the likes of the media portrayals of the war, the nature of the war, and in this short documentary we will focus on its legacy, seeing if it has a legacy and why it remains relevant today. Firstly, we wanted to find out what people know about the war. We took to Avenue campus at our university and asked some students, studying a range of subjects, what they knew of it and their opinions of it. Here are the questions we asked them and what they had to say.
Yes.
Yes. To a degree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
1982? 1982?
No.
No.
Should I? Well, if they want to be British, then let them be British, I suppose. Yeah, okay. Fine.
Not really.
Personally, no. I don't know.
It probably does, but I don't know what the relevance is or influences. I guess a little bit based on like the outcome, just showing that Britain can still hold on to stuff. It might have done, I don't know.
I think it had an impact on the older generation more than us.
We then created a public survey to ask a wider audience what they know of the war and if they particularly cared about the islands. Our survey, which received around 400 responses, found that although most respondents knew the war was against Argentina, only 39% personally care about the sovereignty of the Falkland Islands. Adding to this, a massive 65% have never learned about the Falklands War, i.e. through their school education. A lack of knowledge of the war is certainly influential to its legacy. If people are not aware it even took place, it begs the question of how much an impact it has had or it continues to have. We wish to explore if the war has a legacy and if not, why it is deserving of one. To answer this, we first must look at what the conflict was that so little people know about.
Well, the Falklands were a group of islands off the Argentine coast, which is currently under British jurisdiction. But in the early 80s, the islands marked the location of a bloody chapter within British history, full of conflict and political struggle. The conflict escalated when an Argentine flag was spotted flying high above the South Georgia Island, one of several of the Falkland Islands, by a few workers from a nearby site. Due to its proximity to Argentina, the Falklands had always been liable to takeover, especially since there has been constant negotiations over the island's sovereignty since Britain claimed it in 1833. Such actions from Argentina resulted in swift action from Westminster as the then Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, called British forces to be deployed to the islands. Little did she know the bloodshed that would ensue. The conflict officially commenced on the 2nd of April 1982 and would continue through until the 14th of June, a little more than 2 months, in an area only covering a mere 4,700 square miles. The Argentinian leader, Leopoldo Galtieri, instructed his men to not stand down and to confront the British forces as they reached the islands. Such refusal to step down demonstrated to Thatcher that the only resolution was victory in battle. In Argentina, Galtieri's grip on power was paramount to him and his government, the junta. This was because he headed a military dictatorship and that there was a strong need, even though he was in an undemocratic position, to appease society and restore national pride after a poor economic policy and the disastrous Dirty War which saw over 10,000 Argentines disappear. Alas, to Galtieri, defeating the British and claiming islands under his so-called sphere of influence would be a highly effective way of gaining considerable support from his own people. The war was fought in boggy and dreary conditions, with the islands being geographically exposed to a windy and wet climate. This made fighting considerably more difficult for both sides. To highlight the brutality of the conflict, over the course of the full 74 days, 649 Argentine personnel, 225 British soldiers, and 3 civilians were killed in the conflict. This, added with the conditions they were fighting in, demonstrates this was a hard-fought war, with Argentine surrender occurring on the 14th of June, resulting in the sovereignty of the Falklands being placed back in British hands. We'll now look at the political legacy of the conflict, starting on the policies of Margaret Thatcher.
At the time, Margaret Thatcher was relatively unpopular, and her decision on how to react to Argentina's invasion would influence the public's perception of her as their leader. The war did see her ratings go up, and it has been argued that this was the main reason for her re-election in the now famous khaki election. This meant she could continue her policies and change the Britain as it is today. We were lucky enough to go to the Houses of Parliament to interview Lord Admiral West of Spithead, an officer in the Falklands War and former First Sea Lord whose ship was sunk during the war. He is now Chancellor of Southampton Solent University. He stated that it
helped Margaret Thatcher, of course, win her election, the khaki election, and she did certain changes which changed the country, became much more positive, became much more viable, became much more wealthy.
He then went on to speak on the legacy of the war and stated that
yes, I think it has a legacy in that it has a place in our national consciousness now. Any government would be very, very wary of ceding any aspect of statehood. So I think legacy is that no government would dare change that. Yeah. It would be such a big change. I mean, it would be a sort of thing that might lose you your election, to be quite honest. And you constantly hear people saying, well, are we still able to go and do that again? Well, I think governments have to make sure there are sufficient defence forces in the Falklands just to stop there being a sudden coup de main.
It's certainly credible to argue that Britain's victory in the war was a key contributing factor in Thatcher's re-election. Consequently, the following 8 years of Thatcherism thereafter secured Thatcher's place in British history as one of the most famous and divisive prime ministers, so much so that she is frequently used as a benchmark which other politicians are pitted against. This legacy has lasted to the present day, whereby the current Prime Minister, Theresa May, is frequently compared to Thatcher. As well as a significant political legacy, the war has also had an important impact on Britain's national defence. There is no doubt that the Falklands War left a lasting military legacy to Britain, particularly with regards to her naval capability. Prior to the conflict, the 1981 Defence Review outlined that Britain's 3 aircraft carriers were either going to be scrapped or sold. However, as a result of the conflict and the key role these ships and others played in the war, these cuts consequently never materialised. Indeed, the Navy proved to be the most crucial branch of the armed forces in the recapture of the islands, as demonstrated by the words of General Julian Thompson, who commanded the landing forces.
The fact was, it was a maritime war from beginning to end, and until the Navy made it safe for us to land, there was no point in trying to land. And once we landed and carried out the fighting, all the time we had to be supported by the Navy, fed by them, supplied with ammunition, protected by them against the Argentine Air Force. So without them, all the battles on land would have been totally irrelevant because they wouldn't have actually happened.
To this day, the Royal Navy still retains its aircraft carrier capability, and is set to do so for at least the next 50 years. This demonstrates that the fundamental lessons from the war have been learned in terms of maintaining a variety of ships capable of responding to a range of unexpected scenarios, and that these lessons still cast their shadow over current defence policy regarding the Royal Navy today.
As well as in politics, the Falklands War had a sizable impact on the British media that can still be felt today. The conflict created huge debate over the media's responsibility to conform to the government's position and the politics of reporting on war. The Sun's infamous Gotcha headline highlights their extreme jingoism during the war. It reflected a pro-war point of view which can be seen by the use of the term "our lads." It remains one of the most memorable newspaper headlines from the war. Subsequently, the headline was changed between editions, but this isn't very well remembered. This is a trend which is later repeated in the 2015 Gotcha Backs headline in response to Britain's dedication of more troops to the island. The war's most notorious clash of government and the media resulted in a complete reassessment of the process of reporting on war. On May 26, 1982, the BBC World Service revealed critical strategic information about the location of the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment. Hoping to use surprise to take Goose Green, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Jones was furious to find their plans had been released ahead of time. Both the World Service and the Ministry of Defence launched immediate inquests into the leak. The idea that the media overstepped the line is still prevalent today. Our interview with a former Navy firefighter shows this perfectly. I believe the media handled their role poorly. There was too much information given away regarding task force positions, leading to lives lost and damage incurred. However, this wasn't a one-sided debate. While the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom was established in 1979, the organisation's 1983 pamphlet talks about how crucial the war was in drawing attention to the cause. Referring to Thatcher's totalitarian approach to the media during the war, the pressure group considered the government's level of interference in journalism totally unacceptable. Showing the continuing legacy of the Falklands War, the organisation's current manifesto still reflects this hatred of political interference in the media. This is very much an ongoing debate, the campaign continuing to thrive after its initial surge of popularity in the immediate aftermath of the 1982 conflict.
If the war is to have a legacy, people must be educated about it and be aware of why it took place and why it deserves to be remembered. Although the Falklands War was one fought directly by Britain, it is not specifically covered in the national curriculum for history. Therefore, it begs the question of how we can expect the war to have a legacy if younger generations are not even aware it took place. It cannot simply be left to the veterans of the war to pass on the story. Southampton's involvement in the war has meant we have had an opportunity as history students to learn more about a conflict which had local impact. Even as university students, this is the first chance many of us have had to learn about the war. Nationally, it is unlikely schools will choose to teach about the Falklands War, as their topics must fit around the outlined curriculum. For example, the guidelines state that students should learn about significant events, people and places in their locality, but for many, the Falklands was not something which was heavily significant solely on their local area. Of course, nationally it had a huge effect, but many places were not directly involved in the war, like Southampton or neighbouring Portsmouth was. If students are not really taught about it, then a legacy will cease to exist. Even at primary level, one local school states that in Key Stage 2, students will learn about Southampton at war, whereby the Falklands could be taught. But instead, it is the impact of World War II on the area and the docks. How can we expect the war to have a legacy, especially in an area in which it featured heavily in the local media at the time, and impacted the people, if locals and the wider population are growing up not even knowing it took place?
Even though Southampton's local media showed an incredible feeling of empathy towards the people of the Falklands, this can hardly be felt today. The Daily Echo's letter to the editor section showed an outpouring of support for the people of the islands. The letters expressed their disappointment in the government for failing to protect their brethren on the islands. This is probably because of the high population of former Falklanders living in the city, so many that Southampton earned the affectionate nickname Stanley of the North. One example was, "I have never been so ashamed to be called British. The Argentine action has made the British government look like a bunch of incompetent fools." Considering that it is a key part of Southampton's local history, it is surprising that it isn't more celebrated today. It seems that Southampton's bond with the island has largely been forgotten. While there are several monuments, the conflict's 35th anniversary passed with little fanfare.
But what about outside Britain? The Falklands referendum of 2013 asked islanders if they wanted to keep their current political status as part of the United Kingdom. This was done under pressure from Argentina and specifically the president at the time, Cristina Kirchner. The results clearly backed up the feeling that the Falklands were British, with 90% of the population turning out to vote and only 3 people voting against it. This highlights that after the war, even 31 years later, the people of the Falkland Islands still wanted to be British, which demonstrates the legacy of the Falklands War. Prime Minister of the time, David Cameron, even said, "The Falkland Islands may be thousands of miles away, but they are British through and through, and that is how they want to stay, and people should know we will always be there to defend them." The relationship between the Falkland Islands and Argentina is still strained. The Falklands government states that the Argentine government has made them a key part of its foreign policy agenda in the recent years. In furtherance of this, the Argentine government continually makes several inaccurate statements relating to their history and people. This has led them to correcting Argentina in a publication called 50 Years of Argentine Falsehoods at the United Nations. The government also states that they want nothing more than to have a relationship of cooperation for mutual benefit with Argentina and all of their neighbours. However, laws threatening sanctions against companies involved in peaceful commerce in both countries all point to a desire by Argentina to frustrate the island's international trade and attempt to isolate them.
As of 1994, Argentina outlined in their constitution that the islands are under their jurisdiction and they will continue to lay claim. So much so that former President Cristina Kirchner included it in her presidential campaign and in UN General Assemblies. The Argentine legacy of the war is likely to change due to the new president, Mauricio Macri, adopting a more lenient policy towards their claims on the islands. He stated, "We'll continue with the claim, but I will try to start a new type of relationship." Considering the claims to the island still make up a fundamental part of the Argentine politics, it emphasised the war's relevance today. In 2014, when the BBC programme Top Gear visited Argentina for their Patagonia special, they ran into trouble with the locals. After putting the number plate H982FKL on one of the cars, the BBC film team and the hosts were confronted and driven out of their hotel by a group of nationalists and war veterans. As the team were trying to get away, they were met with locals armed with rocks and sticks. This incident shows how high tensions between the nations are and how passionate the population are on the subject. Also in 2014, the Argentine football team was seen holding their politically charged banner declaring the Malvinas are Argentine to a crowd of 52,000. This banner is regularly shown by the team at games, but due to the proximity of the World Cup, this event created new attention to the 1982 war and its legacy.
2017 marks the 35th anniversary of the Falklands War. This documentary has highlighted that younger generations overlook the Falklands War. Fundamentally, they aren't educated on the conflict and therefore they don't understand its impact and legacy. The war had a real and impactful legacy as it led to a reversal in military spending, it changed the relationship between the UK and Argentina, and led to an ongoing debate over the ethics of war reporting. This demonstrates the conflict's relevance in today's society and so should be more acknowledged, especially as the issue is still ongoing. These are our thoughts, but what do you think? Tell us in the comments below.